The recording is now in progress. Just to recap really quickly, our WISE professional panel is something that we've done every year with the OWHE conference, and we aspire to center justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion and careers related to JEDI in this panel. We also want to hear inspiration, tips, advice from those who are or have worked in higher ed. So we've chosen you three today based on recommendations from the board. And I want to give you all a chance to provide space to introduce yourself and your background, names, pronouns, where you're working now, and years in higher ed. And Brianna, we'll start with you.
Hi everyone, good morning. Brianna Stansbury, she, they pronouns. And I currently work at the Oregon Food Bank as the Associate Director for Equity and Administration. But I was in higher ed for about 7 years, and my last position was the Director of a Multicultural Center at Portland Community College. Thanks for the space for intros.
And then Brooke.
Shio, everybody, Brooke Dakodoa. Hello, my name is Brooke Colley. I'm, well, I have a lot of things I kind of want to say about who I am really quick, so I'll kind of cover a little bit of ground here. So I'm a mixed race, intertribal citizen of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The pronoun I'm using right now is Yaga. It's a non-gendered inclusive pronoun from the Chinook language, although I am also working to recover pronouns from my Kiksh languages. And so that is a journey figuring out pronouns. I'm currently the chair of the Native American Studies program at Southern Oregon University. I'm also the coordinator of our new Ethnic and Racial Studies program. And I've been in higher ed pretty much my whole life. I was going to colleges with my mom. She was kind of the forever student. So I remember growing up on the Oregon State University campus and their longhouse, crawling around under tables. And then I was a pretty long distance student as well, or a long distance runner of a student as well. Like I was a student for about 17 years. Once I entered higher ed, I just kind of continued until I got my doctorate. And now I've been teaching for about a decade, and 7 years of that has been at Southern Oregon University. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, that's all for now.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Shishay Sang, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently the SEEDS program director at Reed College, and SEEDS stands for Students for Equity, Student for Education, Equity, and Direct Service. And so we're basically the community engagement department of Reed College, and we do a lot of different things to support students and connecting them with the local Portland community. I am in higher ed professionally for about 3-4 years. But before that, I was very active as an undergrad and grad student within student affairs as well. So I was involved with NASPA, and I was a NUF, I was a GAP, and I've been attending conferences before that. So non-professionally, I have a few more years on top of that. So nice meeting everyone.
Thank you all for allowing us to get to know a little bit more about yourself. I have my list of questions, and want to just add that you are welcome to respond to whatever question I ask. You don't all have to have a formulated answer to each question. We'll go with popcorn style answering. And as I mentioned, everyone feel welcome to post questions in the chat, and I will try my best to incorporate them in. But our first question is, how has transforming together been relevant to your professional life over this past year?
So I guess I'll get started. I don't know that I had any prepared answers, because this is one of the things about this last few years is I've been learning that I have to be really, really agile all of the time, right? So I pretty much, I don't know about how others feel about this, but I feel like the work that we've been doing has really increased our work hours. And, maybe when the pandemic first started, there was a moment of kind of a breath when I was able to actually slow down, which was strange. For a lot of people, it was the opposite way, but I actually slowed down at the beginning. And then once we started utilizing all this technology, Zoom technology, things really picked up quickly. And all of a sudden I went from having, you know, a fairly full workload all of the time to an exceptionally full workload all of the time. And so part of my metamorphosis, so, you know, and thinking about this transforming and becoming something else was I've actually started to feel a little bit like I've become, you know, that futuristic half machine, half human kind of person where I live between this online space and this in-person space. And I'm always interfacing between more and more organizations and more communities. And in some ways, it's amazing to have that opportunity to be able to bring people into our classrooms, to be able to meet with folks who are in faraway places, you know, in one space. But it's also meant that sometimes I'm just doing things on the fly and having to be agile and having to step into spaces that I'm completely, you know, sometimes feel unprepared for, but luckily, and I think this is to maybe the point of why we might be on this panel, is learning some skills to do that and to be able to quickly pivot, right, to something new and to try very hard to bring our whole selves to those moments as we go, right? So being really holistic about being fully present, you know, as I pivot into a new direction and into a new place. So I'd think that's for the last year has been a big part of transforming for me, is learning how to, you know, interface between all these places without losing my sense of completeness and wholeness as a human being.
I so appreciate that answer. And I'll piggyback off of the piece around wholeness as a person. I feel like so much of this last year has been recentering our personhood within what has been such a chaotic and ambiguous few years. And so I've been really grateful to sit in care-centered spaces in the workplace and think about borrowing your language, think about agility and nimbleness as it relates to supporting one another in the workspace, and how innovative we have to be to like push against capitalism and forge new pathways, forge new understandings of what it means to show up as whole humans in our work. And that has been just like a really gorgeous process to get to. I think this is the first year that I've felt really empowered to say no to things at work, to show up super authentically, to be a little bit messier in the work. And I think some of the best learning and the best growth can come in that space of messiness. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, that tie. I'm definitely an external processor, so I appreciate getting to like put those little bits together. And I'll just end with feeling like transforming together means recommitting to our personhood and recommitting to like that heart work with one another.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what both of you said. And then I think for me, in my experience, transforming together in the past year especially means like a whole organization really have to be in it together in order to do these kind of changes or transformation. Because in the past year, so many things, or years, so many things have happened, and we see all these professional organization or the institution you're at saying, well, we're committed to change, we want to do this, we want to do that. But a lot of times it feels like they're just saying it, but not the entire organization is like committed to it. Even within like the offices that I was in, everyone is not like on the same page at the same time. So I find that to myself, I've learned that, wow, like if you want real change, everyone really needs to be on the same page. And that's going to be it could be very challenging and time consuming to get to that point. But without doing that, like we can't really transform together.
Can we add more things after on one question? Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. This is your time.
Okay, yeah, Shishay, I would really appreciate what you just said about, I think that the painful growth in this time, you know, transforming, and it's all very nice to think we just kind of can change into butterflies, right? But it actually is very painful. And people's people are struggling, right, to figure out like those shared definitions and shared transformative qualities, right? And I think that in a way we're going through some really big growing pains in higher ed right now. And there are a lot of people who I believe, think that they are wanting to contribute to good, positive social change and transformation, but who sometimes haven't ever been gifted like the tools or brought into spaces to learn how to do that well. And so I find it very clunky. I find it a very clunky process, a kind of a start and stop kind of process, a process that seems like, it can put relationships, great strains on relationships, and yet the potential in it, right? The possibilities there are so exceptional to do that messy work, as you said, Brianna, right? To be in those complicated, difficult spaces together and to stay in those spaces. And I do this kind of like organization and interpersonal work that sometimes is like in the middle of conflicts, right? And disagreements and deep feelings of harm and hurt that people bring with them and sometimes carry with them, right? And so I think that that commitment and recommitment and love, love always has to be centered, in working with people, even as you can sometimes be very frustrated, or it can, not feel always safe or kind, in those spaces, but to keep bringing yourself and trying very hard to, speak well and generously to one another throughout that process seems really important right now.
Absolutely. Thank you all for such a great discussion around our first question. And I am also going to try my best to ask these questions and then try and be accessible in posting them in the chat as well. But question 2 for our panelists, what is your mission and purpose? If you had a mission statement, what would it be that has led you to where you are today? And who do you have to thank for who you are today?
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in first. So the word even mission is a little problematic for me as a Native American person. So I think of like my vision or my values or like my community, orientation. And all of that comes down to reconnection, right? With myself, with others around me, and with the land, right? The land is always centered. And so the mission is to protect and serve and well, those two words together, interesting. So protect and care and be in service to, maybe is a better way of saying it, to the health and wellness of the land. And I think as we take care of the land, our homelands, the waterways, we take care of human beings too, right? And so those reconnections to land, those reconnections to tribal peoples and first peoples of these places, the sort of coming back to ourselves and healing from these intergenerational traumas, like those are really front and center for me. I'm also really interested in upholding tribal sovereignty and tribes' rights. So those are central to like everything that I've done and continue to do today. And also, love of elders and love of young people, and wanting to be in bridge positions, right? Like being able to bridge space between folks, bridge differences, bridge creativity and possibility and justice, right? Like projects together so that we make power together rather than taking it from one another, right? And I have lots of people to thank. I mean, mentors, absolutely. My family, I have got wonderful parents and generations of families to thank for, being here, the beauty of being here, the bitter struggle that they had to go through for me to be here, and the great deal of love and care that people experience. So I think that, thinking about ancestors, thinking about future generations, both of those directions help me know like what I'm supposed to do right now, right? Thinking that 7 or 8 generation behind and in front. And then also, you know, just these incredible people who always tell me, like one of my friends, Kermit Rohde, who was this like 90-year-old, you know, non-native, you know, white elder, you know, who I really met early in my life. He told me, you know, as a young Native woman, I had to use my voice to speak truth. Otherwise, other people would speak on my behalf and I may not like what they had to say. And I remember struggling against that, you know, and not wanting to be somebody who used my voice in that way or to speak up or to get in front of people. And I think for a lot of people today, they'd be surprised by that, you know, that I was terrified to speak and to lead and to share. And you know, everybody, mentors come from every place, right? Every part of our communities. And I still see his mentorship and the mentorship of other coming through me as I mentor others today, right? And so that beautiful cycle of mentorship seems really, really important to me. And so it really helps like sort of center me and keep me centered as I move through the work.
I can go next. Yeah, I think in my work, I've always wanted to make meaning since I started doing like higher ed, student affairs stuff. But I think like my mission and vision have changed a lot, and it's always changing. I don't think I would just stick with one thing. But I feel like when I first started and I was an undergrad, when I was like doing peer mentorship, I was the most happy when I see my students happy. So that became a big reason why I want to do this, because I'm like, wow, like I can help my student do what they want and become who they want to be. So that was a big thing. But then when I went into grad school, that was when I learned a lot about like social justice. There was a lot of like talks and like conversations within higher ed. And then of course, being at Lewis and Clark, that program that I was in was very social justice based. So at that time, we learned about what mitigating inequality means. We learned about how to bring justice to higher education and all these topics. So that became a really big thing before that. And then I think, of course, society have went on and had a lot of different things that happened that kind of pull higher ed into that. So then that became a lot of our job. I'm sure a lot of you who are listening right now is like, wow, like your job right now has a lot to do with like what society is doing and their reaction and how you need to act as a student affairs professional or a higher ed person to help in this conversation or help the institution like be proactive about what's happening in society. So that was a big thing. But then now I feel like after COVID, I have been like pushed back to how to help my students find happiness and help manifesting themselves, because I see that they have been so tired and a lot of things have been taken away from them as college students. And so if they're not well personally, how are they supposed to go out and do all these great things and bring equality and talk about social justice, right? So I think recently my vision has become going back to like, okay, how can I do my job to support my students so they're happy, they're well, and that they're able to be okay so that they can do bigger things when they're out there. And I think for me, who I have to thank are all the people who are kind to me. I think all of those people who have been kind to me are the ones that will offer me help or say yes when I ask them for help, which I learned that is not always a yes thing. So I always thank those people who say yes to me and is there to support me without like expecting anything in return.
I will start. I have similar themes in my answer as both Shishay and Brooke. And I'll start a little bit before myself. So it's a little bit hard for me to talk about my own purpose without talking about where I come from and the folks that I come from. So I'll start with just a little anecdote, which is that my parents were married in 1987, which was 20 short years after Loving v. Virginia passed in the Supreme Court, and Loving v. Virginia made it possible for interracial marriage to be legalized in the United States at that time. So I identify as a multiracial Black queer femme. My dad's Black and my mom is white. And they, even though it was 20 years after Loving v. Virginia, I say it's 20 short years because people protested their wedding. They lost friends and family, and they also committed to equity and justice, that at that time, love meant more to them than the adversity they would face pursuing it. And so watching them cultivate love as an anecdote to white supremacy culture has felt like a really strong theme. And I feel that like viscerally, I feel it in my body. And so I've always had this story of like, how do we push against these systems, and how do we do it together? And how do we do it like in a care-centered and love-centered way, like through the heart? And one of my favorite mentors, who I don't know personally, or I didn't have the opportunity to know personally, is Bell Hooks, and she's a Black feminist, and she says that love is an action, that it's a verb. And so I try to hold that coupled with my own story of my parents pushing against these systems. When I was coming out, I grew up in Oakland, and when I was coming out, Proposition 8 was on the table. So I was like a 16-year-old watching Proposition 8, which was one of the first initial Supreme Court decisions to overturn or legalize gay marriage. And I was I had this story, right, of like policies and the ways that my parents pushed against policies and systems to enact their values and to push against white supremacist culture. But I hadn't felt that for myself. I hadn't seen that for myself. And so as I was coming out as a gay person, and Proposition 8 was like paralleling my experience in the Supreme Court. And I just, things felt like they sunk in for me in really real ways about how my life needed to be aligned with continuing to dismantle systems of oppression that affect me and also my communities and the people that I love. And so that's what drives me. And similar to both of you, my list of mentors is so long. It's so long, probably more than I can name, but definitely a huge gratitude to the folks who have had patience with me, and those who have been willing to go through the messiness of accountability processes and of conflict. Sometimes support is silent. So all of my silent supporters, which also includes like places and plants, and I'll say my current mentor, one of my current mentors, aside from all of my wonderful people mentors, is I am trying really hard to learn from my cat. She is a fur relative, and she is so good at rest. It is inherent for her. Like 20 hours a day, she is closing her eyes and enjoying a nap. And I think so many of us student affairs professionals can learn from that. So she is a mentor in that way. Thanks for this question.
Brianna, what's so funny about you saying that is like we were talking about a radical napping event at SOU. Like we're like, what's the best way we could actually take care of ourselves that doesn't like engage in capitalism and doesn't like require anybody to be in, like in the service role, like just go take a nap on the grassy knoll. So we're gonna have this radical collective napping event. I love your cats also. That would be they would be a mentor to me as well.
I love that. Thank you all for those really, I think just such relatable responses. I think so much about what's wonderful about this panel is you're putting words to, I think, how a lot of us have felt working in higher ed. So I appreciate that. And my next question I have for you all is, what systems of support or opportunities have you created for others in your role? Or what have you seen created that is valuable and supportive at your institution?
I'd happily defer to my other panelists if they'd like to go first, but if they're not quite ready, I'm happy to.
The NAP ministry.
Okay. We do a lot of work at Southern Oregon University to try to address like these issues in multifaceted ways. I work in the Native American Studies program, and it's been there. It was the oldest Native American Studies program in Oregon. It was the first. And I think that I came into working at Southern Oregon on a wonderful foundation that was built by my two other people that I consider my family and mentors, David West and Brent Florendo. And a whole lot of folks at Southern Oregon University who like helped with the lift of bringing Native American studies into existence. Native American studies, like all the ethnic studies fields, comes into existence because of students and communities asking and fighting and struggling and demanding those programs, because of course academia wasn't created for most of our communities. And so finding and those disciplinary silos often would be exclusionary or of some of the voices of our communities, like scholars and theorists and activists and artists and creatives and so on. But also sometimes in those like siloed disciplines of academia, knowledges that do come from our communities would be included, but in ways that would disconnect them, right, from our community's needs, right, and the goals and objectives. And so I was really blessed to come into a program like that. But we knew that there was still work to do, and we struggled to, we're going to be creating a major in Native American Studies. That's like one of the major goals. But before I even wanted to pivot to that work, I was really concerned we didn't have other ethnic studies fields at SOU. And so we've been working, I would never take credit by myself for any of these things. And I just want to be really clear, like these are all collective projects. There are many hands and many people contributing to make these lifts, but we were like, we need an ethnic studies program. And a couple of students in the great tradition of ethnic studies said, we want to see this happen. And they kind of, they had a petition and they got other student voices, and they came to me and a couple other faculty and got us to work with them. And now we have an ethnic and racial studies minor. I hope that will grow quickly into something more substantial too, but we are in our first year of that minor at Southern Oregon University. We have had our first Pacific Islander Studies class with a Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian instructor who's going to continue to teach next year. So we now have 3 classes on the books. I think next year she's teaching an Pacific Islander environmental studies class and an introduction to hula. And we also have some Black studies classes that are going to be created and run for the first time next year. And my great hope, right, is that we continue to grow all of those programs. I mean, I would love to see a full major in Black studies and Indigenous Pacific Islander studies and Asian American studies and Chicana Latinx studies, and we also are trying to be inclusive of sort of the racialization of certain religious minorities, including like Jewish studies and Muslim studies. So we're doing that work. It's taken a while. We had a speaker series to help train our faculty. So I was really proud of some of my colleagues. There's only a few of us that actually had degrees in ethnic studies fields, and the people who wanted to be part of the catalog with us, who wanted to have their classes be included, they're doing some hard work, right, to continue to transform their own knowledge so that they can teach those classes in a way that is accurate and respectful and responsive. And so we had a wonderful speaker series this last year with 7 speakers from those different ethnic studies fields that I mentioned, coming and talking about their experiences in ethnic studies and having kind of a conversation like we're having here. So I think that like that has been really valuable work. We also create a lot of programming in Native Studies, including our powwow. We're going to have our 29th annual powwow this year, and it's back in person after 2 years, not right? And we have a queer Indigenous gathering that students put on every year. We just had my 8th, but SOU 7th annual queer Indigenous gathering with queer Indigenous artists, activists, and scholars, doing amazing things, talking about their lived experiences. And we were able to get both Southern Oregon University and the city of Ashland to officially recognize Indigenous Peoples Day a few years ago. So now we have these really excellent Indigenous Peoples Day programs. One thing I have noticed though, is that some of these programs, right, ends up requiring a lot of our time and effort. So this really small group of people puts on these great big events, right, which are really actually for other people. Right. And so while I love them and they're beautiful, I am thinking about like how we can just rest. A lot of the students at SOU have never been in Ashland really and gotten to experience the restaurants or the Oregon Shakespeare Festival or any of the like beautiful hikes around here. And so trying to figure out how to like, curate fun, and coordinate joy, and do those kinds of things with students is really like at the top of my list right now, and food and sustenance and how do we get fed, so I think those are the kinds of opportunities that are exciting, but we have a lot of work still to do as well.
Well, I have my mentor now on my neck, trying to tell me that she lives here rent free and she's resting. So yes, and it's so amazing that everything is happening at your institution, Brooke. That's awesome to hear every time something like that happens. And then I think for me, I've been in 2 institutions so far, and when I'm at Reed, they have a Asian American Pacific Islander affinity group for staff and faculty. So that was really amazing. The first thing came in, my supervisor, who's also Asian, already like added me into that group. So that is so cool because Reed, as you know, is a predominantly white institution. So as the only Asian person in many spaces that I would walk into, it's very nice to know that, okay, every month for one day, I'll have lunch with someone who looks like me and all the other people who looks like me, and we can talk about things and I'll feel safe and comfortable. And I can compare because for my previous institution, also a predominantly white institution, they didn't have a specific like staff and faculty Asian Pacific Islander affinity group. So I was also the only Asian person in a lot of the spaces that I walk into. But then I lacked that group to go to talk about things or to fall back on when something challenging happens. But then at my past institution, there was one person who was a sociology professor, and she's also an Asian professor, and she's the person that seeked me out. She just walked into our office like on my second week, and she's like, "Where's Shishay?" And I'm like, "Who is this lady here?" And then she's like, "Oh, we should have lunch. Let me put something on our calendar." And I'm like, "Who are you? Why are we having lunch?" And so it was just one person who did that to help me feel like really like comfortable and welcomed. And it's just her. And then so it was just really nice to have that. And then so having that experience compared to now immediately being included in the group, that makes a lot of difference. And then so I think for me in the future, I would like to keep providing these kind of spaces for students that look like me, or in other spaces for other people that looks like me. I want to do the same for them as well.
Let's see, I am part of a system of really incredible and capable folks. So I also don't work alone. So big gratitude out to folks who I get to have the honor and pleasure of working with and pushing through different initiatives. One thing I'm really proud of, and it was totally students who drove this, was we partnered with a with an Indigenous farm here in Portland to pay for CSA boxes for food insecure Black and Indigenous students at PCC. This was sort of during protest time, so it was really important that folks had sustenance always, but especially when there are extra layers of complicated things happening in life. So that was one thing that felt like a supportive network, and it allowed folks to be connected long past when PCC no longer could pay for the CSAs. And it created networks of community that weren't there prior. So that was really cool. In my current role at Oregon Food Bank, I do a lot of like non-sexy behind the scenes things. So like grievance policy and handbooks, like employee handbook and things like that, like a lot of details that help drive workplace culture. And one opportunity that I feel really grateful to have been part of supporting is helping to institute extra time for folks. So as CARES Act funding goes away, we still recognize that we are in a global pandemic, that people are being affected, and that the support systems on a systems-based level are being stripped. And so how do we show care and like relevance to people still being affected by something that is widespread and really detrimental. So part of what I helped to push forward was instituting an increased amount of wellness days for employees. Folks can use them for taking time off, getting kiddos out of school if there's an outbreak, being on point for childcare, going to medical appointments, pretty much anything. So that felt like a really big win for me and for my team.
Thank you all. Yeah, that is a big one, Brianna. Congrats. Question 4. Put it in the chat. Tell us about a professional risk that you've taken. And did it pay off? How did it pay off? I hope it paid off.
I can start this one if folks are okay with that. Yeah, my professional risk is that I left the field, and I never in a million years thought I would leave student affairs and higher education. And I, for a really long time, tried to think about how my skills were transferable outside of student affairs, and I didn't quite have a grasp on that. And it's been really cool to see that so much of what I did in the Multicultural Center at Portland Community College, and prior to that, I was in a Women's Resource Center, that so much of that work translates into other workplaces and is about like being community centered and care centered in these ways. And so that is my huge professional risk, and it's just happened in this last year. And I will say that it has paid off. If folks are ever interested in talking about what it looks like to transition out of the field, I'm super open to talking about it and thinking innovatively about it.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think that, you know, one of the things that I think a lot about in this role, you know, in academia, you know, I do love being on a campus. There is something that's always drawn me to being like the forever student, which is what I think I get to do as a professor, you know, to always learn, to always be getting to like engage with new material. So I do love that like sort of energy on a campus and forever studentness. And I cross between like the academic and the student life because I have so much experience on the student life side of the house. I always thought it just made sense for us to like work together really collectively on projects and things. But I do think it's really important for all of us to remember that there's not only one path we can walk down. One of the anxieties I see in academia is people like who kind of imagine that there's not something else they could do with their lives. And so I spend a lot of time, imagining the 10 other lives that I could have, and knowing like that kind of brings me a sense of peace too, to stay in my own work, because I know that if it doesn't function well for me and I need to do something else, like my life's not over, that there's a lot of life, beyond academia. And I encourage my students to think about that. And I encourage my colleagues to think about that, because I think we actually are more joyful in our work when we choose to stay, not because we have to be there. And so working, thinking about like that you can risk, that you can step outside, and the agility of our skill set is so transferable to so many things. I think there's like 20 jobs that I saw just in this last year that I'm like, oh, I want to do that, and I'm not, but but I could have, and it would have been fine, and it would have been exciting, and it would have continued the good work that I care about, but in a different institutional context or outside of institutions at all, right? And I think one of our questions later is like, can institutions do anti-racist work? I'm not 100% sure, right, is my quickest answer. So sometimes I think it is like the way we like transgress even within our institutions, that's the most important work. But in terms of risks, I don't know if I even like think of what I do as a risk taking as much as it's just necessity, right? And so there's nothing else to do but to keep doing this work, right? Like so sometimes I'll have this conversation with students who are feeling really, and colleagues and friends and family members who are feeling frustrated by the world we live in today, and hopefulness is kind of being diminished. And I keep thinking like, well, if you do this work and it never produces the outcome that you want, is the work still valuable? Is the work still important? Should we still be engaged in it? And almost everybody is like, yeah, and I think about like the great leaders who've led social justice movements in the past, and the vast majority of them have never saw manifestations of their work come into existence. And we're still struggling around some of those issues today, right? And so to me, I sometimes imagine this like steam engine of colonialism coming down the track, and like us on that little hand crank, trying to go the other direction. But it is, I would do that work forever. That is the only thing to do. And as far as risks go, I think opening my mouth and speaking on my own behalf maybe was the biggest risk I took. And now that people can't get me to stop talking, I guess. So there we go. And I think it's paid off in that I'm happy and, love life, and, not without stresses or the extra lines that are starting to grow on my forehead. But, gosh, I have so much like to be deeply grateful for, right? I have deep gratitude for this life that I live. And that's the way I want to like carry myself, forward as I get older. And I think that maybe it has paid off, because I'm seeing that same like care for self in my students. Like they're valuing themselves. They're saying, I deserve to be resourced. I deserve to be paid when I do work. I deserve to take a rest when I need to and put it down. And I think that we are the ones showing that, and it's hard, right? I'm not always successful at it, but I keep on thinking like I have to live the things I'm saying to my students, because otherwise they're going to know that that's not true, right? They're going to keep up a cycle of nonsense that a lot of us were born into, right? And so figuring out a way to like sort of really mentor by living the way that I'm teaching, I think maybe is the biggest risk that's paid off.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I echo a lot of what you both have said. And I think my biggest risk was always to jump out of my own comfort zone. I think my first job back in California, it was comfortable. The coworkers were good. They treated us like family. Yeah, everything was comfortable. But then it was hard to make the decision to move across state and stuff. But then I think being able to just be like, really thinking what else I can accomplish and what more will I learn about myself by jumping out of that comfort zone really have benefited me. And it was not easy. Like coming back this time, I have my partner and 2 cats with me. That's a big risk to move to a state where we don't have family. We don't really have a big group of friends up here. It's just really us and whatever I knew when I was in grad school. But yeah, it paid off because I wasn't happy anymore in the work that I do in the past institution. So being able to know that, hey, like you should feel happy in your job instead of just comfortable. And then now being at a place where I feel better and I'm learning new things and doing new things, that has benefited me a lot. And I do like where I am at right now. So yeah, it's hard. It's going to be hard to make that jump, but I think it's good because you never know what you can accomplish until you actually just like took that leap forward.
Absolutely. And also Rita's very happy that you took the leap. So thank you. And then Brooke, you mentioned it. The next question, I'll post it here in the chat. What does anti-racist work look like for you? And how do you think an organization can do anti-racist work? Or, you know, if you had a magic wand, what would that look like? I know it's a ridiculously big question.
I will start this time. Yeah, I think for an organization to do the anti-racist work is really putting money and resources to where their mouth is. Like what I mentioned before, like a lot of institutions are saying a lot of things about they're anti-racist, they want to do this, they want to do that. But when it comes to when you ask the people in the organization, like, do they see the money being put into it? Do they see the resources put into it? Do they see the care that they give to the staff who might be experiencing these issues within their organization? So I think that's really important for an organization to do. And I think most of the time in an organization, usually the people on top has the power to make these changes, not the people like the frontline people. So I think as an organization, and that's the people who are the leaders of those organizations, they need to recognize that and then do it. But I think for myself personally, in my short new professional experience, I've understand that like anti-racist work is not just gonna work if I am being loud and just like was screaming at my direct supervisor about it. So I have taken another approach and really just focusing on my daily work and all of my job responsibilities. I think extra hard and extra intentionally on in this task that I need to do or my team needs to do. How can we make it as anti-racist as possible? How can we use whatever resources we have currently from that organization and really do the work out there with that limited resources that we have. So like the approach is really just focusing on the small things that I can do right now, and then hoping that from that can build up into bigger things and then inspire bigger change within the bigger organization that I'm at.
I'm pretty skeptical that institutions can really do it. I think that what you're talking about, you know, Shishe, is the performative nature, right? And we talk a lot about like institutions having statements of certain kinds or those land acknowledgements that became really kind of hot for a while there. I know because I got calls from every institution under the sun asking me to help them with one for about a year. So, you know, those like statements and strategic plans and all these things are very nice. But, and I think Shishe mentioned this earlier, but the definition matters, right? And if not everybody's on the same page about what racism is, then they can't figure out any way to like institutionalize processes for anti-racism. And I think that there is a great deal of differences of opinion about people, what people's thoughts are on what racism is. And I find that, you know, I love my institution. I love a lot of people in it. I think we have lots of great colleagues, but I think, you know, at my institution, but also across the country, talking about race is one of the hardest things to do. In my classes, we do it all the time, but and because like I engage in conversations about, this term that's now like a political hot potato, systemic racism. I studied like Albert Memmi and racism, and like I know that it is built into systems, right? And being able to like talk about that versus some sort of action, like somebody saying mean or pejorative or racist words, or somebody acting in a really like an individual act, right? Versus the way that the structural the institution is like structured and created over time. And sometimes I think that the racism that's embedded in my institution, most people, they can see it, they don't like it, they want it to be different, but where to change the institution itself, the structure itself to address it, that's really challenging. My friend Gina Kaysen, Dr. Gina Kaysen at Georgia State University, she had a podcast called About South, and it was all about like, what is the South, right? And the South, like the South means a lot of things to different people. And where even the South is located is, we could be in contentious conversation about that. And in one of her podcasts was about this little creature called the blue crayfish. It was a blue crayfish, and she was trying to find the origins of the blue crayfish. And every time she'd think she'd find the origin, they'd find an expert, they'd go someplace, they'd say, look, actually it wasn't here, it was someplace else. And I kind of think of like racism in institutions as that blue crayfish, like, it's there, everybody can see it. They know, everybody knows it exists, but nobody knows how to get to the origin. Like nobody knows how to find the origin in the institution, like, and name it and disrupt it and change it, right? Because that's what anti-racism is. You have to like see it, you have to say it, you have to disrupt it, and then you have to change it, right? There's no other way to do it. And yet like everybody's like, it's not me, it's that other guy, right? Or it's not me, it's over there, right? And so we have to figure out the location and agree on it, like in a shared way, for that to actually even begin to do the work of anti-racism as an institution. So right now, I think that work's being done by individuals. I think it's being done by communities. It's being done by our students who have less and less interest in with dealing with that nonsense, no patience whatsoever, right, for it. And people like my child who's about to be a teenager, who's coming up and saying, we're not interested in those discriminatory structures anymore. Like we want none of that, right? And so a lot like those of us in my age, my position, my place in that bridge work between generations, like have a lot of work cut out for us right now, because we also can see it, but we really need to like help folks like find it, disrupt it, and put something different there, right? Lay a different foundation. So.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. That was amazing. I feel like I was looking for reactions on the bottom of my screen. I'm just like over here feeling so inspired by what you all have to say. Yeah, I think I agree. I don't know. I'm skeptical that institutions can be truly anti-racist. And I think that there would need to be some huge foundational work. I agree. I think people don't have common language and common frameworks that we're operating under, which causes a lot of miscommunication. I think that, yeah, I think that we need to like dismantle, there's this saying in like the protest community to like dismantle or kill the cop in your head. And I just think that there's a need for us to dismantle our own values as they tie to white supremacy, and like figure out how we are surveilling or operating in with white supremacy as a central point, before we're actually able to push forward any movement within our systems. And because those tenets like urgency and perfectionism and individualism, like all of those things will come through if we're not careful and thoughtful and intentional and constantly doing that work, right? It's not this like to the point about performance, like it's not going to a seminar and deciding we are now anti-racist. It's like a continued practice for life and for always. And I just am skeptical that institutions, without completely overtraining themselves, can actually do that. But I am heartened that I see so many individual people committing to that work in really big ways. Thanks for mentioning like younger generations. It's so beautiful to watch Gen Z like have a different pattern with like workplace dynamics and deconstructing how things can be and should be and will be. So even though I'm skeptical about institutions, I'm really inspired by individual and collective action. I'm inspired by mutual aid. I'm inspired by communities of color. I'm inspired by queer and trans folks who are always pushing and being radical and watching their good work and their good labor help to eradicate these really, really toxic and terrible systems. So that's my messy answer.
Really quick, Brianna, like, would you say like, I mean, I was just trying to think of like what we could actually like, what I would love to see happen is like the people who are in the leadership, the folks who are at the top of that hierarchy, to like get behind us and help with the lift. And trust that we actually know what we're doing. I think that's the other thing. There's a lot of trust in institutions that's not there, that would make us have a better community if we could figure out a way to like instill that in a real way. And so I think if anybody's listening who's like in a power position at your university, just find a way to go right there and help with the lift with the folks that are doing that work, right? Don't question why. I mean, don't question too much about like whether they know what they're doing, because I think sometimes like those of us who are doing this like work within our institutions, we feel marginalized too, right? We get discriminated against too. We get talked down to, especially like, I'm a middle-aged woman, but people think I'm very young by how I look. And so I'm like, don't talk down, lift up, work together, be a part of it. That's what I think people could do. And if I was like a president of a university, I would look for the people in those positions and I would like really get behind them and help with that lift. And I think that's something that can be done.
I love that message. Thank you. So the next question, I feel like you all have kind of hit on this, but I'm gonna post it anyways. What advice would you have for your younger self about your career? Or what advice would you give to our attendees about their careers?
This is my favorite question, actually. I was like, I would tell myself to not give up my creative endeavors. So graduate school, like destroyed. I used to crochet. I used to make pottery. I used to do all these like artistic things. So I would tell myself not to give those up, because when, it's kind of like when you don't do those things regularly, you forget. Like biking. I used to bike everywhere and I stopped biking. So I tell my younger self to keep moving, because I feel like those are really, really important for this work. We need to be able to like have our bodies move. Like we need to be taking care of like more parts of ourselves than just the work. And so that's what I would remind my younger self, is to retain those things, so I'm not feeling so separated from those parts of myself, the creative, the movement, especially now that we're like, becoming partial robots with our interfacing with technology, right? We really need to also balance that out with movement of some sort. And so that's what I would tell myself, is get up there, move your body, dance as much as possible.
I would say to my younger self to really always stand up and do what you believe in, because I don't think anyone else can be more true to yourself than you. You know what you want, you know what makes you happy, so do that. Don't let the other noises out there sway you. And I think for people who are interested in this career or are wondering, go talk to as many people in the field as you can. And you see, like the three of us here, we're all in a higher ed, or not anymore, but we've been in higher ed, and we have all these different experience. And I'm sure each of our path is so different. So if you're thinking about it and you want to learn more, just go talk to people like us, and I'm sure we're nice people that will say yes to a quick chat about what is happening, like what we think about the field and things like that. And I think from there, then you can learn a lot more than what like people have been telling you, or your professors, or your teachers, or your classmates. Like you need these kind of like diverse thoughts in order for you to inform yourself on your next move.
Advice I'd give to my younger self: I was really committed to grind and hustle culture. And I thought that was the best way to move up and move around. And I would tell little B to sit down with a cup of tea and just chill out a little bit. I think that I don't know that it made me a better person to be so ingrained in grind culture. I think I could have used the program that you're developing, Brooke, the napping program. I think I could have used a little bit more rest, and I wish I'd had the fortitude and the foresight to spread that in my community too. I think those around me were also hustling and grinding. So trying to reject that is what I would give to my younger self.
And maybe you're like, I love Lil B, by the way, and I like somebody posted, that's great. They called me Big B, so there we go. Yeah, so you're enough. Like that alone, right? You're enough. Right. And I would tell myself that, and I tell my students that, like they're enough, you know, and that's a really important message too.
Yes. And can I like add in one more thing to that point? Somebody I work with, their name is Chanel. They said this week, and I've been thinking about it daily. They said, sorry. The quagmire of work from home is that so many other moving parts. Thanks for your grace, y'all. Chanel said this week that they are trying to resist their understanding of imposter syndrome, that in that same vein of like, I am enough, but resisting imposter syndrome because it tells us that especially as queer and trans folks of color, it tells us that we should assimilate to these problematic and colonial systems. And by not doing that, by showing up as who we are and feeling that imposter syndrome, it's a sign that we are not doing this very thing we're working against. And it's just been blowing my mind. And so I feel like that framing, Brooke, of like, you are enough, I wish Lil B had that, and then had that like outlook for imposter syndrome. I think I spent a lot of my younger career days feeling like, oh, I've got to do so much more to prove myself. And I didn't. I just needed to take a nap and know that that these systems weren't built for my people, and that showing up in the way I was enough. Thank you. I might even take a nap after this panel, y'all.
I feel like I'm so glad you're all here today. I feel like you have contributed to such an important conversation, and from such different walks of life, which I also think is so important to hear from. And I also want to remind folks that you can post questions in the chat for our panelists. We have 20 minutes left, but that doesn't mean we have to be here for another 20 minutes. So we can definitely wrap things up.
We can do that last question about podcasts though, because I have a whole bunch of podcasts I want to tell people about.
Ooh, okay, yeah.
One of the questions that I thought we had was like, do you have any like recommendations for?
Yeah, I had that as an optional, but we'll do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, I want to talk about Andy Murphy's uh, podcast, Toasted Sister, uh, Andy, A-N-D-I, Murphy. And Toasted Sister is all about like Indigenous food culture. And it's one of the most glorious podcasts. Andy Murphy, who's from the Southwest, I believe she's Dene, but I don't want to be quoted on that right now because but I believe she's Danae, and she goes around and she talks to chefs and food producers, and it's just like in terms of a podcast that is like feels like sustenance, like when you listen to it, like you can chew on it, and it makes you like smile and feel really good. And it also teaches about like really hard things alongside like food and community work that's being done, but it's beauty, like it's what we struggle for, right? It is beauty. And so I would like to suggest that folks take a look at that Toasted Sister podcast. Also, Andy Murphy works with people who are amazing artists, and her like logos and artwork around her show is incredible. Also, Finding Cleo, which is looking into like violence against Native children and then Native women, and so looking at particularly in a Canadian context. So that's called Finding Cleo. And then All My Relations is another podcast that two Indigenous women, Atika Wilbur and Adrian Keene, the two of them do all sorts of incredible stuff, and they're both beautiful. And when they share and about our issues and things that are important to Native America, but really make it like accessible to everyone. And it also feels like, you know, two beautiful people coming together for that tea, right? And lifting each other up and laughing. Matika's laugh is very infectious. So I would just like to offer those three podcasts to our guests. Highly recommended.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, I don't listen to podcasts specifically, but then I do ever since I started commuting in the car. My radio is always on like NPR and OPB, and I always tell my partner, "Am I an old lady for listening to the radio all the time?" But they're actually so great. Like in the morning, they have the news, and then they also like during the evening time, like they recommend all these like podcasts. Like I've heard of these names because they have been either interviewed by the people on OPB or they talked about the books and stuff like that. So it's just like a great way to just get exposed to all these great creatives and things out there. And then you pick what you like and then you can dive into these specific ones. So I am a great supporter of public radio.
Me too. Big ups to those suggestions. I tried to take some notes, but please fill in the blanks. I am going to uplift again the NAP ministry. You can find them on Instagram. Trisha Hershey is the founder of the organization, and they explore the radical power of rest as resistance. And Trisha Hershey specifically talks about rest as it relates to Black bodies. It's beautiful, beautiful bodies of work. And then also Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown has just been like gorgeous and mind-blowing. I use it in my work. We're reading it on my team right now and applying it to what we do. And then Adrienne Marie Brown put out a smaller, maybe 100-page book called We Do Not Cancel Us, I think. And it's about the power of transformative justice and how we sit in that messiness and how conflict can be generative. And so that's been really helpful. Pretty much anything Adrienne Marie Brown I recommend. Pleasure Activism is also amazing. And then there is a workbook. There's a free PDF online called Turning Towards Each Other, I believe. And it's about conflict and care and transformative justice. So those are my big ones.
I think I would add This Land also by Rebecca Nagel. It's excellent, especially if you're interested in like law and policy and like how the Supreme Court works, but like you looking at like cases that directly affect Native communities, and recent attacks on the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is really, really important issue for us right now, because for Native folks, the attack on Indian Child Welfare Act actually is an attack on tribal sovereignty, and it's a really important issue that I hope more people learn about. So yeah, and I agree with everything that the other said too. I also think OPB, NPR, yes, and those books as well. Awesome.
Thank you so much. All right, y'all. I want to thank you for joining us today. We have amazing panelists, and I'm so happy to have known all of you in some capacity and that we were able to have you join us today. I'm going to wrap it up early because we still have a lot of conference left. I'm sure some of you are also trying to incorporate your, day-to-day jobs between this conference. So I want to give you space to fill your cup, literally or metaphorically. Yeah, please reach out if our panelists are comfortable sharing their contact information in the chat. And I just want to plug, we do have another session. We have student staff in higher ed later today at noon. We also have a town hall today at 2 o'clock. And I believe, Rita, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have the affinity space, the LGBTQIA+ affinity space after this. So keep checking the calendar. We hope to see you. And otherwise, have a great rest of your morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's been a lot of fun, and it was nice meeting you other panelists.
And I'm gonna